but it's not interactive. So welcome everyone, welcome to Columbia University. My name is David Phillips and I head the program on Peacebuilding and Rights. And it's a great pleasure to welcome the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs, Nisha Desai Biswal, to campus.
It's great to be on this campus finally.
Well, we know coming from the UN to the Upper West Side is a little bit of a commute, but we're delighted that you're here. I'm going to say a word of welcome, and then I think Visakha will speak a little bit about current conditions in Sri Lanka from her perspective before we give you the floor.
Great.
And we're on the record, so after your remarks, we'll take questions, have a conversation, and think a little bit about how we can make Sri Lanka a greater success story.
Excellent.
Which is what we're all committed to. So I was introduced to Sri Lanka about 5 years ago by your predecessor, by Bob Blake, with whom I had worked previously. And he knew of my reconciliation activities in other parts of the world, thought that there was useful work that Columbia could do in Sri Lanka, so we launched a program there. And we did that at an extremely interesting time. It was after the end of the Civil War, but before the political transition. And we put our oar in the water and did what we could to try to mobilize civil society in service of a reconciliation agenda. We worked with some universities and the Ministry of Education to develop a social harmony curriculum. We had our religion department here at Columbia interpret the curriculum based on the Pali Canon, and then we presented that curriculum to some of the seminaries in Sri Lanka. We were involved in a shared history project with the Pathfinder Foundation, looking at the history of state building, and we had people of different ages, men, women, people of different ethnicities, all participating in collaborative research and writing. We worked closely with Lanka on a humanitarian dialogue. We wanted to see how development assistance could be framed through a conflict resolution lens so that we could achieve two goals simultaneously. We were also involved with providing training and capacity building to the Tamil National Alliance. We brought them to the United States. We had seminars here and in Sri Lanka on a range of important topics like minority language rights, the UN human rights machinery, transitional justice strategies, land issues, and local policing plans, all of which are critical in transition countries. With the National Peace Center, we organized seminars on transitional justice, particularly global truth-telling, trying to find that balance between accountability and reconciliation so that all the sectors of society would feel as though they were stakeholders in the future. We published our proceedings in Sinhalese and in Tamil and distributed those. As part of our work with local partners, we had the very good fortune of collaborating with the Association of War-Affected Women, with Visakha Dharmadasa, who is our co-sponsor here. We brought Lema Gwobi, the Nobel Prize winner from Liberia, to Sri Lanka. She interacted with women at the grassroots. Based on the great preparatory work that Visakha did, we developed a reconciliation agenda which was not defined from the top down but from the bottom up, with women's voices in the lead. That was all published and widely disseminated. Our last activity in Sri Lanka was something that was sponsored by the government of Japan. We were asked to do an assessment of reconstruction and reconciliation. And my emphasis, of course, was on the reconciliation side. The Japanese government wanted us to focus on the reconstruction side. So we prepared a report. It was very balanced and even-handed. But before the Japanese government released it, they shared it with Colombo, and the report, of course, was changed. So I ended up releasing the original version of the report just prior to the UN Human Rights Council. And we feel that the unsanitized version of that paper actually brought Japan into the abstention category, as well as other countries. So at that moment leading up to the tipping point, we feel that the accumulated effort of Colombia over a few years contributed to bringing Sri Lanka to a moment of ripeness. Of course, sitting here on 118th Street, our involvement is going to be limited. The way that we work is always through local partners. We take our guidance from them, we work in close collaboration with them. The things that we did in Sri Lanka we could not have done without partners like Visaka and AWAW. We've learned greatly from your efforts at the grassroots. We're continuing our partnership, looking at reconciliation strategies and structures. You came from Colombo to greet the Assistant Secretary and our guests. The floor is yours, Visaka.
Thank you very much. It's good afternoon and thank you. Very welcome to all of you and thank you, ma'am, for being here. It's an honor for us. And thank you, David, also for agreeing to host us here in Colombia, as well to continue with this forum. As I think, as all of you know, that last year, 2015 January, the people of Sri Lanka was able to make that very important historic change in our country. Because though Sri Lanka was a post-war, like from 2009 after the defeat of the LTTE, the regime which was in office never looked at reconciliation in the way that we wanted it to be. Not only reconciliation, many aspects of the way that the former regime was behaving, it was an issue for the civil society. So in 2015, we did manage to bring in the new government, which I must say that it has brought a lot of hope to all Sri Lankans. No matter where they are, whether they are within the country or outside, it has brought a lot of hope. And as soon as they came into office, especially looking at reconciliation as a priority, the President in his speech on the Independence Day emphasized that reconciliation is a priority in the country. And true to his word, he established the Office of National Unity and Reconciliation, headed by the former President, Madam Chandrika Bandaranaike herself, who was exactly voted like 62%, especially calling at that time in 1994, because people across the country had faith in her. And also the government did pledge at the UN, and they did co-sponsor the resolution, and they proposed 4 mechanisms. One is an office for missing persons, and a judicial mechanism with a special counsel, a commission for truth, justice, reconciliation and non-recurrence, an office for reparation. These exactly keeping in line with the transitional justice, the 4 pillars, the government proposed these mechanisms. And they also took a couple of initiatives towards that. One is the Prime Minister's Action Group, as well a technical committee, a working committee who is working on the technical side of the mechanisms, and a consultation task force on reconciliation mechanisms, and a secretariat to coordinate all this effort. And I'm really happy that I'm one of the members of the consultation task force on reconciliation mechanisms. Exactly as Sri Lankans, it's comprised of 11 civil society members across from all the religions, ethnicities, as well the demography of the country. And we are very proud and happy to serve in our country, especially because at this moment it's very important. And we have developed the consultations program in such a way we will be having sectoral consultations, means different sectors where we'll have national consultations like the armed forces, political parties, religious groups, media, youth. So these will be the consultations will be at the national level, and then we also will be having public town hall meetings at the zonal level. We have divided the country into 15 zones, 8 districts of the north and east, and the remaining 7 provinces. So we will have the consultations there as public consultations. As well, there will be focus group discussions on issue base, especially because there are different issues which the country have faced, and also the issues differs from province to province. So we wanted to have an issue base. As well, there are in special cases there's one-to-one consultations, and also people can make their submissions online or also write via email or post. So this is how the consultations will be carried out, and we have already started the consultations. We had it on the 9th of this month. We had a first sectoral consultation which lay religious, and on the 16th, and that's why I'm leaving tomorrow, because 16th morning we'll have with the armed forces, and the 17th with the professionals like the bar associations and the chamber. So we are really looking forward. We also are very happy with the consultations. We have got lots of submissions coming in. At the moment, the government have already drafted the bill on the missing people, on the Office of the Missing People. And then we were very happy because initially we were a little worried when the government is going ahead with the technical work of it, thinking that, then why should we even do the consultations, because already you are putting this in place. But of course we were advised by Pablo de Grief, the special envoy to the, I think, High Commissioner for Human Rights, telling that we can still shape it. And true to his word, the government accepted our submissions. We gave a summary of the submissions that we have already received. So they did rework on the bill, and we were also told that there are different stages when it's in the parliament and when it's taken up, and we could still contribute. And so that's for the consultations, and especially speaking about this policy forum, why we wanted to have it here, especially because we believe that having the resolution itself have brought our reconciliation process to the international fora, and especially in New York, we wanted to tell what's happening in Sri Lanka to the people, to the international community, the permanent missions here. As well, we want to learn from the best practices. Because of the fact that Sri Lanka is facing a challenge, we have to understand that it's not like any other place in the world. We are having a biggest challenge from a democratically elected former president. So it's a huge challenge for the government of Sri Lanka. Every step it takes, it has to be very cautious because, it's a democratically elected government. So that is why it's extremely important for us to learn from other best practices, as well share our the activities that the government take. So this is why this policy forum is extremely important, ma'am, and thank you very much for coming today. We really look forward for all the support that everybody could give. We do also need funds. Sri Lanka have had 2 disasters this month, which is really unprecedented, the armory, and of course even the floods and the landslides. So we do need the help of everybody. So that's why I'm here, and thank you very much for coming, and also thank you very much, ma'am. And we really look forward for the government of US to walk this journey together with us. Thank you.
Visaka, thank you very much. I'm not going to give a long introduction of our guest speaker. I've already mentioned that she is the Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs. She's held this post since 2013. She has a long history working in the State Department, in the National Security Council, with non-governmental organizations. Because Sri Lanka is at a pivotal moment, it needs encouragement and partnerships. The reason we've launched the Sri Lanka Policy Forum is to try to identify ways that we can all work together to contribute to the country's success. We're so pleased to hear from you about the policies and approaches of the U.S. government and to engage in a discussion about what we can do in order to move Sri Lanka forward. You're most welcome to you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here, especially as you launch the Sri Lanka Policy Forum. David, both you in your personal capacity and in your institutional capacity have been a tremendous force for advancing peace building and human rights. And not just in the context of Sri Lanka. I was hearing earlier today from some of our colleagues at the U.S. mission at the UN about the work that you have supported with respect to Syria as well. And I really do commend you for the passion and the commitment and the insights that you bring to these efforts. And we're proud to have been able to work with you and learn from you on that as well. I also want to really commend Vishaka and the work that the Association of War Affected Women has done. I mean, the work of civil society in Sri Lanka, particularly during times when it was difficult and dangerous, and the persistence and the perseverance and the sacrifices that you and really women across Sri Lanka have made in the pursuit of peace, in the pursuit of creating a different future for the people of Sri Lanka, is something that we all stand in awe of. And I know that in my many visits to Sri Lanka, every time I sit down with and engage with some of the women, and particularly the war widows, it's impossible not to hear their stories and understand about the incredible and lasting impact of war, and the importance, therefore, of engaging these perspectives in how you then talk about coming out of conflict and creating lasting or enduring peace. So I just want to say thank you for the life that you are living and the example that you are living in every aspect of your engagement. Since we've gone into some depth already about some of the situation, and since I'm speaking for the record here as well, I'm going to go through and talk a little bit, but summarize a little bit the context that I want to give to you about where we find ourselves today. And I'm going to apologize in advance to my crack speech writing team that I'm going to veer from my prepared remarks a bit as we talk, just so I can reflect on some of the important points, both that David and that Vishaka have already put forward. But I'm going to start with just the two early visits that I made to Sri Lanka. One, when I was a young staffer on Capitol Hill, going on a trip focused on HIV/AIDS, and it was still while the conflict was ongoing. I think it was in the late 1990s. And the feeling that I got at that time in Colombo about all the lost opportunities of Sri Lanka. I would hear from people all the time saying, we were once one of the Asian tigers. We were once the country that Lee Kuan Yew compared Singapore to and aspired that Singapore could maybe one day be like Sri Lanka. And look what happened. And that unrealized potential was palpable to me, even back in the 90s when I had those conversations. And then the conversations that I had in my first trip as Assistant Secretary of State where I met with the previous government, and I met with civil society, and I met with the business community, and I went up to Jaffna, and I had a series of conversations there. And the palpable feeling I got that things were headed in the wrong direction, and that people were starting to lose hope, and that within the faith community, within the media, within the civil society groups, a feeling like almost a loss of hope, and a feeling of perhaps things were going to move back towards conflict because they didn't see where the future was. And during that visit, I made the point in the press that, for the United States of America, we have always been with the Sri Lankan people. And our goal has always been to see an enduring peace and a inclusive and lasting prosperity for the people of Sri Lanka. Of course, what happened in January of 2015 was really a truly transformational election in which the people of Sri Lanka decided that they were going to vote on the basis of hope and not despair, and in which they, in an astonishing election that really none of us necessarily anticipated, we took the reins of democracy in their country and reestablished that strength of democratic institutions in the verdict that they took to the polls. And the focus of the United States, both before that election and after, has been about kind of the twin objectives that really define our engagement with Sri Lanka. And those are the focus for lasting and enduring peace and an inclusive prosperity for the people of Sri Lanka. So clearly, for there to be a consensus and a constituency for peace, it has to come with a measure of prosperity for a population that has for too long been hindered or hampered in meeting their full potential. And for real prosperity to take hold, there has to be environment of enduring peace. And so the two are really intertwined in that sense. So if we think back to what the 30 years of conflict have done to the country, not only the devastating toll on in terms of impact on the people, and on this I'm going to say first and foremost for the record that the United States was supportive of the efforts to combat terrorism and had declared the actions and the activities of the LTTE as being terrorist activities. And so when the government sought to address the terrorist actions of the LTTE, they found in the United States some support for that effort. But on the other hand, the United States also stood very firmly on the need for respect for human rights and a need for a process of accountability and a need for a process for reconciliation. And so while we're thankful that the days of the conflict are behind us, really the healing and the effort to move forward on reconciliation is really truly only just beginning. The government that came into effect in that January 2015 election is a government that we believe has sought to restore Sri Lanka's standing in the global community and has sought to chart a path of engagement and cooperation. And it is that path of engagement and cooperation that created the opportunity for us to work with the government of Sri Lanka for a resolution in Geneva last year that was co-sponsored by Sri Lanka and that committed to a path forward on addressing the outstanding issues of accountability and for creating a path forward that brings together all the people of Sri Lanka and that creates a political, social, and economic participation for all of its citizens. We've seen since the coming into force of that government a lot of very encouraging steps with respect to the effort to return land to its rightful owners, with about 3,400 acres already having been returned so far. The effort to give closure to so many thousands of families whose loved ones are still unaccounted for, and to seek justice and accountability for the perpetrators of the worst crimes of the conflict. Now, at the end of this month, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights will present his initial review of the progress that Sri Lanka has made to date towards the implementation of its Geneva commitments, commitments that Sri Lanka made not just to the international community, but most importantly, the commitments of the government of Sri Lanka to its own people. And I get asked often, and most recently in the congressional testimony, do I think that the government has done enough? And I think that that's probably the wrong question to ask. Not even the government of Sri Lanka will say that they have done enough. But the question is not whether they've done enough, because clearly there is so much more to be done. But whether they are continuing the commitment and making progress on that path. And there I think the answer is a resounding yes. We see progress in towards establishing an office of missing persons, as Vishaka was saying, and the legislation to establish that office of missing persons was introduced. We've seen, as I mentioned, the return of land to the displaced, and we've seen that the current government has welcomed and even encouraged the visit of UN Special Rapporteurs to be able to provide the kind of technical support, experience, and expertise and best practices that can help shape the government's views on reconciliation, on accountability. We've seen the consultations with civil society, which you outlined earlier, and not just with civil society, but with all of the key constituencies that have a stake in reconciliation. We've also seen very, I think, humane and humanitarian gestures like the decision to issue certificates of absence for the families of the missing. One of the most heart-wrenching experiences has been to talk to family members who don't know the fate, or are still waiting to hear, or are still caught in this limbo of not being able to move forward, to be able to deal with issues of inheritance or land or property ownership and title because of this questionable status of their missing loved ones. And so these certificates of absence have been an important aspect of one, bringing closure, and two, allowing families to be able to move forward and to move on. We, have seen the decision to issue passports to and welcome back to Sri Lanka many of those who had fled in prior years or had sought asylum abroad. The decision to delist many of the political groups that had been deemed terrorists by the previous government, and to release many of the people that had been detained or held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But the work of reconciliation is really just at its beginning phase, and the hardest work is still ahead. But as Secretary Kerry was very clear to say during his visit last May, this is not a journey that Sri Lanka needs to take alone. This is a journey where the United States has made a strong and deep commitment to walk that path, to provide our support, to provide the technical expertise that we can bring to bear, but also to provide the moral support for these bold decisions that the government and commitments that the government is undertaking. Sri Lanka needs more than just the support of its powerful friends to succeed. It also needs to be able to show to its people the benefits of walking this hard journey. The benefits of creating a more inclusive economy and creating a more accountable government, and showing that by taking these important, difficult, and courageous steps, that they will indeed be bringing forward a better future for their children and their children's children. And that path of creating enduring and sustainable and inclusive prosperity is as important as being able to create an enduring peace. What are the ways that Sri Lanka can pursue that path of prosperity and growth? Well, first of all, making sure that all segments of society are part of the economy and have opportunity is equally important. That there is opportunity in the north and in the east as well as the south. And that there is opportunity that engages the women of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka needs to be able to harness the productive power and the strength of all of its citizenry, and the women are a key component of that. Again, as my boss, Secretary Kerry, said last year on his trip to Sri Lanka, for any society to thrive, women have to be full participants. They have to have full participation in the economics and in the political life. And certainly women must have a voice in the conversations about peace and security and reconciliation. Equally essential will be the role of women in building the economy. They're already doing a lot of the heavy lifting in helping the needy and the displaced, and supporting the ex-combatants, and in supporting their rehabilitation and reintegration into society. in working with and supporting many of the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and there is unfortunately a large community of victims that are survivors of gender-based violence. But also, because so many of the husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons were killed in the conflict, there are also a lot of women who have been the head of household, who have been supporting their families, who have been working and to ensure that those women are fully integrated into the economy, or receiving the kind of training and opportunity is going to be critically important. And I know that that's a big focus of the work that you're doing, Vishaka, with your organization in also ensuring that women have an opportunity in the economy as we move forward. And it is a focus of how the U.S. government, through USAID, is also trying to engage in some of the post-conflict programming that we're doing in the country. In Trincomalee, for example, I think we've started, we've helped start a new apparel factories that are employing many of the women who are impacted by the war. And in other parts of the country, where we're supporting a lot of efforts to strengthen small and medium-sized businesses and create new jobs for the war affected. The impact of these small interventions on individual lives can be tremendous, but it also has a cumulative effect on creating the political space in the country. As the benefits of these kinds of interventions radiate throughout families and communities. On the macro level, also, we see an opportunity to support and strengthen Sri Lanka's economic prospects. We know that Sri Lanka, which is such a strategically situated right on the sea lanes of commerce and as a gateway to the major markets of Asia, that Sri Lanka can play a tremendous role in tapping into the emerging and growing economies of Asia. And for it to do that, it will need to really invest in its tremendous human resources, well-educated, hardworking, and entrepreneurial population. It's an area where I know that the Prime Minister and the President are very focused to be able to strengthen the education and invest in the skilled labor force that can really help the Sri Lankan economy be well situated. It has some of the finest natural deep water harbors that can be developed into, again, a major area for commerce, and I know that this is another area that the government has prioritized and is looking at. It says one of the top 30 busiest ports in the world is in Trincomalee, moving over 5 million containers per year. And you can imagine the amount of growth that can be sustained in this as you look at some of the other major ports and opportunities in Sri Lanka. And with the current focus by the World Bank and the IMF to help Sri Lanka address some of the long-standing concerns with respect to some of the bilateral and multilateral debt and some of the economic reforms, and the IMF just announced a major standby loan, I think in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion or $2 billion. I'm trying to remember, but that as Sri Lanka takes the necessary steps to create the enabling environment and put in place the economic reforms, that you will see that the tremendous amount of potential to grow that economy is something that is going to attract the interest and the investment of the private sector of the United States, of major Asian economies, India, Japan. China will continue to be a major investor and partner. And this will create the prospect of a more enduring and inclusive prosperity as well. And so for the United States, we will be engaged on both the transitional justice and strengthening governance, as well as supporting the economic reforms that create opportunity. We have seen from the visit of Secretary Kerry in May of last year a surge in the assistance programs that we're providing, from a point where we had almost closed our mission to now we're ramping up and staffing up, and we've seen again a sustained commitment from the U.S. Congress in terms of the funding that Congress itself has appropriated and has continued to provide. And so while there is very much a long road ahead, as far as I can see, there is a tremendous amount of interest here in the United States, but also across the international community, to be able to walk that road together and to be able to show that the bold decisions that the Sri Lankan people took and the courage that its government has demonstrated are going to yield some tangible benefits for the people of Sri Lanka in all communities. And I don't know, why don't I just stop there and turn this into more of a conversation?
Thank you. That's terrific. So we're going to invite our guests to make statements or ask questions, but before opening the floor, Visakha, is there something that you would like to add or a question to present? And the floor is yours. Questions from the audience.
What other countries?
Would you identify yourself in questioning?
Excuse me?
Would you identify your name and affiliation?
I'm not affiliated. My name is Leona Norick Gold. You mentioned China, you mentioned the U.S. Anybody else involved in helping partnerships, businesses?
Sure. I think what we have seen is a tremendous amount of interest and support from a growing number of countries. I know that one of the first visits that a newly elected Prime Minister of India made was to Sri Lanka, and I think India will continue to be an important partner. But also, as I talk to colleagues in the UK, colleagues in Japan, in Australia, a tremendous amount of interest and support. President Sirisena was just in Japan on the margins of the G7 Leaders Summit, and had very good conversations, I know, with a number of the leaders there. And so I think that there's a strong desire. I met recently with counterparts from the German Foreign Ministry, and they were talking as well about their desire to strengthen their support. So I think Sri Lanka is starting to see the interest and the engagement from very many number of countries.
Turn to my left.
Hi, I'm Manapurta. I'm a student at City College.
Identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ana Puente. I'm a student at City College for Political Science. And I have a question. When you talk about strengthening education and the labor force in Sri Lanka, how will you avoid the exploitative labor model that happens when there has been presence of state violence in Sri Lanka and poor communities, especially Tamil communities, in order not to fall into that trap that Southeast Asian countries have undergone with global powers getting involved in their economies. How would you avoid that happening?
So, you know, one of the
Repeating the question, I'm so sorry, or could someone restate it because we can't hear a thing back there.
So I'll repeat Ms. Puente's question. She asked, how do we avoid exploitative labor practices during this time of political and economic transition?
one of the most important tools you can provide to a workforce is to be able to have the much needed skills and education that can allow them to, first of all, have opportunities. And so for the U.S. government, you know, the support we can provide to schools and universities in terms of advancing literacy, in terms of strengthening higher education opportunities. One of the most effective programs that I've seen was in Vietnam, where we worked with the private sector to strengthen engineering education in Vietnam to ensure that that there were the high-skilled workforce that could attract the high-skilled jobs and the high-value jobs. And so the extent to which you can invest in your workforce and create the kind of skills that attract the high-valued jobs that can be, as you pointed out, less exploitative and empower the workforce to be able to compete for those high-value jobs. I think that that's an important aspect of it. The extent to which you work with companies to create better working conditions and environments. Again, a big part of the work that we do in many countries is working to strengthen the factories to create better work environments, to create cleaner conditions, to strengthen workforce safety, as we're doing, for example, right now in Bangladesh with the garment sector. So I think there are many, many ways that we can engage in our efforts to create the kind of work that can bring value and bring dignity.
I'm glad you mentioned the garment sector because in Sri Lanka that's an important area of economic activity, and companies like L Brands and PVH have pioneered a set of workers' rights standards, which has now been adopted by local Sri Lankan companies. So we're very pleased that there are job opportunities, but also that the international partners are holding local partners to a high standard and that they're working well together. You had a question?
My name is Shivani and I'm a student. So you said that Sri Lanka, the government is taking a lot of encouraging steps towards reconciliation. So I have two questions. The first is about the land they've returned. How much land do they have left to return? So you said they've returned 3,400 acres. So what percentage of total land is that? How much they should be returning? And then my second question is about the certificates of absences. So can you just tell me what exactly that means and how that will offer the Sri Lankan people closure?
So on the land, I would say there's probably differing figures in different parts, depending on who you talk to.
I have
On
one figure.
Why don't you let her answer those two
Sorry,
questions, please?
so
Sorry.
I have heard figures everywhere from, you know, in the 5,000 acres, which I think is too low, to 20,000 acres or more. So I don't know how much, depending on what the calculus is. And one of the things that we've actually recommended is that they undertake a comprehensive survey to establish more definitive figures on exactly how much land is in government hands, under what conditions, and to be able to establish that in an empirical way. I don't know, Vishaka, if you have more on
I of course also don't have a figure, but definitely 30 long years of conflict. The armed forces did occupy big areas of land. And now, I mean, they definitely gave Vadamarachi North. I mean, that's exactly where the most fertile land. And still around Palali, there are land occupied by the military. The government is slowly releasing, but definitely people want it much more quick. I mean, perfectly understandable, and it's on the process of releasing, but still it's a long way to go. And also, I mean, 30 long years, people have got new families, so the demand is or has also grown a lot. The certificate of absence is on because of the fact that the families of the disappeared. I mean, definitely they want to go on with their life, and that's why they want to give the certificates of absence. Not exactly, ma'am, going as a closure. It's not a closure. I mean, that's exactly the biggest argument. It's don't close. I mean, because the person is missing, not dead, and which is very much understandable. So that's why for the process of dealing with the land, maybe dealing with inheritance, maybe dealing with very day-to-day things. So that's why the certificate of absence in the absence of a certificate of death. And with also with provisions that if the person is living, so that they can revoke it. So with lots of provisions that the certificates of absence will come for the day-to-day life of the family. It's not a closure. Definitely not a closure.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yes. No, because that's a huge issue of, yeah.
Yes.
There's also a security dimension to the slow rate of returning properties. Many of these lands have been mined, and there is an effort to set up mine action centers to demine these areas, but that's a laborious and slow process. You can't reclaim these lands and make them commercially viable until they've been demined. And that's a collaborative effort now between society and the government, which is moving this process forward.
David, don't we have new technology for demining land, which includes robots and drones and so forth?
So I've been hearing about new technology for many decades now.
But also the maps. The biggest issue is the maps as well the floods. So even if you have a map, the floods takes the bombs everywhere. So that's that, and also no maps of the. Otherwise, if they had proper maps, then it would have been easier.
But even during the times when we were not able to do much else in terms of assistance, the one part of our engagement that has stayed steadfast and increased has been on the demining. And we've had a sizable program of support for demining consistently over the past 4 or 5 years that I.
So is it still human-based, or is it changing to robots and other things?
It's humans.
But in parts of the world, we're using other kinds of technologies, I understand.
So
Is that correct?
I would probably have to get back to you in terms of the different tools that our folks are supporting in terms of trying to bring in some of the more advanced technologies. I've certainly seen in many other countries some of the new tools that are being deployed, whether it's on underwater demining versus land.
Can I jump in? I'm Patricia Desai.
Oh, I should have.
Hi, Nisha.
Hi.
I was the U.S. ambassador
Yes.
to Sri Lanka from 2009 to 12, and I have a question. Let me address Barbara's. When I was there, we had a big demining program. Of course, somebody has to fund these programs, and India was there, Norway was there, Sweden was there. The funding eventually began to peter out. The Sri Lankan government, the army, began to learn how to do it, and they are actually it was very labor intensive, not technology. They hired some of the Tamil women, trained them carefully to go ahead and locate mines, because it was employment for them. And at that point, I think they had a very good safety record. So it's not just always technology. Yeah. Sometimes it's just putting human resources. But somebody has to fund these programs.
So we've surged our funding again.
This is a larger issue. One of the things I learned when I was leaving Sri Lanka was that as much as we wanted to, we could not force reconciliation on a government, on a population, or even the desire for reconciliation. And I found that many of the Tamils, so traumatized, were more focused on finding that loved one, or how am I going to feed my kids, or I think they're coming after me again, whatever. And then and a lot of the Sinhalese I thought were not interested. They were happy the violence was over. They had suffered in different ways. And my impression, and people would tell me this, is we're going to move forward. We're not going to look back. That's our way. That's the Sri Lankan way. And so how do you, either any of you, or the ambassador here, I'll drag you in, sir. Do you feel that the majority population, the Buddhist Sinhalese majority population, really thinks reconciliation is something that is necessary for them, as well as for the whole country?
Can I?
Sure.
Yes.
And then I'll chime in.
Yes. It all depends upon like how much you are exposed to the conflict. Largely, people are happy because they can move around in the country, and for that reason, they know that they have to have, a good relation so that there won't be any reoccurrence. But as you said, that there is definitely a divide where the majority of the Tamil population who is from the north and east, who feels that they do have very, very serious issues to be settled. And of course, when it comes to the larger population of the Sinhalese, it is for them is more economical and more non-recurrence. So there is a clear divide of the desires of the two peoples. But having said that, I must also say that people of Sri Lanka, they, from even 1994, when we thought that it was very difficult to use the word of peace, when Madam Chandrika came into office, she could really change it very quickly. And even now, because of the fact that if you can really remember the political campaign of President Sirisena was very much on reconciliation, and people did vote for him. So it's the very small minority of the extremist voice which comes and it amplifies. But normally the majority is silent, and it's exactly the civil society that we have a duty of really making the larger population, pro reconciliation. So that's exactly on us, and that's what we are also trying with Colombia. David is going to come to Sri Lanka in August. We are trying our level best to go to the people, tell them that this is the opportunity and we can't really miss this.
And I'm sure that that the ambassador and David can speak to this a little bit, but one, there's not a monolithic view, and it's not static; it's evolving, and reconciliation isn't necessarily a finish line that you cross, but a process that is an evolving process. One of the things that Ambassador Butenis can attest to is that there were different narratives in different communities of what had transpired. It wasn't just a different language or a different political reality. It was a different history and a different interpretation of history and a different narrative of the current context. And so part of reconciliation is actually trying to create a common narrative for Sri Lanka and create a common and shared understanding. And that, I think, if you approach, so many of even the, as I would talk to faith leaders and leaders in the Buddhist monasteries, and they would say, that so much is now coming to light for so many in the Sinhalese community about some of the acts that had transpired in the past that they actually didn't know about because the media environment was controlled enough that the Sinhalese language press would not necessarily write on or report on certain things. And similarly, in the Tamil press about some of the things that are happening now that can be further communicated through the Tamil press, and so you start getting to a point where you can actually create some of the common narratives that can then be the basis on which reconciliation can be pursued. It's not a easy or a fast process.
Your Excellency?
Thank you, Dave. Just to pick up on that last point, the idea of a common narrative. Now, this is something which is engaging the attention of the government with the establishment of what was referred to by Nisha as ONU, or Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, headed by former President Chandrika Kumar, who was here recently in New York, and she addressed the UN on this. And the priorities of this new body is to work towards this common narrative through depiction of history in its proper context, address the distortions which have taken place over the years, promoting art and culture and interaction with the North and the South. So these are the priority areas on which the ONU is working. Now, to set the backdrop to all this, when we talk of historic change of January 2015, one of the important I would say a landmark was that on February 4th, for the first time, the government acknowledged the mistakes of the past. And there was an act of contrition, an apology to all victims of conflict for the political mistakes, both in the South and the North.
That's right.
And that was the break with the past. Once the government acknowledged, I think the path was clear for great reconciliation. And I was last week in Sri Lanka, as Assistant Secretary Biswal mentioned, the policy of engagement with the international community, with our international partners, the United States and others, plus the High Commission of Human Rights, Special Rapporteur, and WD Brief in particular, have been working very, very closely, as Mr. knows, on the work of the task force, the framing of questions for the consultative process. And he was in Sri Lanka last week to talk to the military, with military personnel of other countries who have undergone similar experiences. But before you get into the deep end of setting up trial chambers and so on, just to put them together and exchange experiences. And I happened to be there on the opening day, and I could see that there was the conversation among military personnel of other countries and in Sri Lanka. There was certain bonding that was taking place, but of course, the hard questions were there. But the fact was that a conversation had started. And I think these are positives coming up with this policy of engagement.
After the civil war in Nigeria, there was a slogan, no victor, no vanquished.
Yep.
When we entered Sri Lanka in 2011, we couldn't even talk about reconciliation. There was no one in the government who would even entertain a dialogue about it. Now you have a new government which is actively promoting reconciliation and setting up all of these structures and strategies to advance this goal. So that's a sea change from where it was when we entered the country. Very pleased that the new administration and you and your colleagues are carrying this banner forward.
Challenges are there, but still a start has been made.
You know, Madeleine Albright famously said that reconciliation is a lot like riding a bicycle. You fall off when you stop pedaling. So there will be challenges going forward. We just have to keep working at it.
I like that.
That's really
Okay, so
nice.
other questions? This young lady here.
Sure. So my name is Elizabeth Kennedy, and I work with Independent Diplomat and also USTPAP, which is a US-based Tamil diaspora group here in the US. First, thank you to both Saka and Ambassador Biswal for your comments.
Can you speak up, please?
Sure. So just to put something in context, currently there are 17 out of 21 Army divisions located in the north and east of Sri Lanka. There have been 48 arrests under the Prevention of Terrorism Act since 2015, and there are ongoing cases of torture and sexual violence, including one just last week by a Tamil man visiting his family. So in a situation where the military is still very much embedded in the north and the east, and there are many ongoing human rights violations, it's hard for me to imagine a Tamil victim feeling comfortable to freely participate in a truth commission or a justice mechanism when the military, who they believe committed human rights violations against their neighbors and their family, is still living next door to them. So how can the U.S. support and potentially pressure increased security sector reform, which at least publicly, it doesn't seem that there has been very much in the past year?
I would say that these are the most difficult issues to move forward on, in the sense that it takes, I think, a careful approach towards trying to think about the size and the scope of the military. The government has started down that path of rolling back the role of the military in aspects of internal security, law and order, and to devolve some of those powers to the police rather than the military. But there also needs to be a restructuring and resizing of the military into a peacetime military. How do you go from a wartime military to a peacetime military? And what is the role, therefore, of soldiers who would be then decommissioned into peacetime or civilian efforts? Now, one of the great things that the United States did after World War II is we did the GI Bill, which created the path for our military to come out of conflict and see opportunity in future, to be able to go in and get their education and to be able to develop careers. And one of the things that I have recommended both to the government and to the private sector is to think about what are you doing to help create a new future for the military when your soldiers who fought in the war come out of that war. What is their role? Because the war is over. Now, where do they go, and how do they move forward, and how do they become productive members of the country and of the economy? Obviously, notwithstanding the fact that there is another process that should be pursued with respect to accountability, you also have the large size of this military that needs to be thought through in terms of what the defense needs of the country are, and therefore what can be the appropriate size and scope. And those are questions, I think, that the government of Sri Lanka needs to address. But also, what are the questions? What is the role that the private sector can play? I mean, in the United States, we have a strong preference and premium that we place on hiring veterans, and to be able to try to create, again, a way for those who have served in our military to then have opportunity in peacetime and in a civilian economy. And so for Sri Lanka to be able to kind of think through, for those members of the military that can be honorably moved into a civilian space, that will in and of itself decrease the tension and decrease the opportunity for misaction, if that's a word that can be used, from occurring. Because as long as you have a large military presence in a civilian space, then that tension is going to be there, and the potential for continuing transgressions is going to be there. And then the other thing is, an important part of the process is going to have to be not just thinking about accountability in the historical context, but very much accountability in the current context, so that there is a robust process for investigating and for bringing to account when there are transgressions. Part of that challenge is also then that there needs to be some ability for the victims of such transgressions and for the civil society organizations or the human rights organizations that support them to be willing to talk about and bring to light some of those actions. In the past, because of the very dire consequences, sometimes when abuses were reported in any specificity, there's a reluctance on the part of some in the human rights community to actually bring specific details of an abuse or a transgression to light, and that makes it harder to then pursue accountability for that. So it's a little bit of a unfortunate kind of dynamic of those who have suffered in the past unwilling to come forward, but because of that unwillingness to come forward, then an inability to actually pursue accountability.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have more.
Yeah, I mean, one thing also that we have been advocating for peacekeeping, to get to the for peacekeeping for the armed forces. That's one thing that we have been calling UN peacekeeping. The other thing is the consultation task force met the armed forces, all the head of armed forces, as well as the police, and then we had that's exactly the first thing that we did in January. I mean, raising these concerns, like how people can come and come before us if they are worried to come. And as well, we have got contact persons from, they have given us to contact, contact persons within the armed forces. As well, we have the zonal task force who will be conducting, and also telling the people that they can come for consultations, that there won't be any intimidation whatsoever. So that's the message is very clearly conveyed to the armed forces.
So with an eye on the clock, let's take two questions together before we move towards an adjournment. We'll hear from Michiko and then this gentleman. Michiko, ladies first.
Hi, so I have small two questions. One is that I just came from a conference on the role of women in peace and security, where they discussed a lot about the participation of women or women's organizations in the peace process. And so is it correct that in the reconciliation in Sri Lanka, women's organizations were involved from the beginning? And my question is, there was no resistance like happening in many other countries? And so I'm wondering how it started, the women's participation in this process. And then,
It started with Visaka.
No, definitely not only me. I mean, there are a lot of women's groups.
What was really the role of UN in this reconciliation process?
Okay, let's hear from this gentleman and then we'll move to final statements.
Secretary, I'm from the PhD student at Howard University in DC. Would you explain us the role of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and how the funding and how far we've been through the threshold program in Sri Lanka?
Sure.
Next week, yeah.
So why don't we talk first about the role of women in peace and security in Sri Lanka. Vishaka probably has more of the historical perspective. What I will say is that because women have been so greatly impacted in this conflict, there have been, I think, really strong cadre of organizations that have focused on women, of women, for women, that have been a key component of the civil society voice in Sri Lanka, in the north and the east, but also in Colombo and in the south. And there are, there are victims of the conflict all over the country, in all communities of the country. And I think that the role of women has been an important one that's been acknowledged, I think, certainly by those of us in the international community from the get-go, but I think this government also has been very attuned to the voice of women in reconciliation as they have done their consultations and such. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, Resolution 1325 really opened the doors for us in 2000. and women's groups in Sri Lanka have been very much engaged in the peace building, even prior to 2000. And of course, the consultation task force is comprised of 6 women and 5 men. So, we're very proud, at least the government itself has endorsed. And I think the Millennium Challenge, they will be in Sri Lanka, I think, next week or already. We have a threshold.
Sure.
I think,
So the Millennium Challenge Corporation announced that Sri Lanka was eligible for a threshold program. They have subsequently sent in teams. The way the MCC works is that they do a constraints analysis that looks at what are the constraints to economic growth, and where, if the MCC were to bring additional resources to bear, would unlock the most economic impact and potential. Now, the threshold focuses on what are the constraints to Sri Lanka qualifying for a full compact. And then the compact, which is much larger in size and scope, then would look at, what are the specific constraints. In some countries, they've worked on infrastructure, port or road infrastructure. In some countries, they've worked on education. So depending on really the macroeconomic analysis, and they do a pretty thorough job. They send in a large team and they drill down, and they do a wide range of consultations with civil society, with the private sector, with government, with academia, etc., to kind of drill down on that. And then on the basis of that, they will then develop a compact proposal, which they will do with the government of Sri Lanka, but also with consultation with a larger constituency. So right now we're actually on the threshold program. There are still some indicators that I think Sri Lanka was falling short on to qualify for a full-blown compact. So the MCC is in the process. They're, I think, on their second or third visit to Sri Lanka to develop and design some programs that can help support that.
So before we move to our conclusion, is there a final word that you'd like to share?
At the end of the day, this is about the future and the vision that the people of Sri Lanka want for themselves, and the bold choices that they've made. To me, are a reflection of their deep-seated desire for peace and for a better future for their children. And the government that they have elected has been one that has, I think, been singularly committed to trying to fulfill that mandate. And I'm not just saying that because the ambassador is here sitting at the table, but because of the many long hours of conversation that I've had with the foreign minister, with the president, with the prime minister. I went to Sri Lanka 5 times over the last 18 months. So, those visits were really because of the extraordinary things that are happening there, and the extraordinary potential for Sri Lanka to be a leader in this space of transitional justice, of peace building, and of prosperity. It's a really exciting opportunity to be able to be part of that and to be able to work with such amazing people in that country.
Saka, final thought?
Yes, I want to thank you, ma'am, very much, and also thank everybody, thank Hamzadeh and everybody, and especially David, to you. It is a historical moment in our country, and we do need, as I told, the support of each and every one of you all to really walk this journey. And this is the launch of the Policy Forum. We will be having more of the policy forums in New York, because we do need the support of the missions as well as the civil society here. We want the correct messages to be told as well, we want to learn from the best practices. And thank you ever so much for coming today, and also really looking forward to walk the journey with all of you to make our country a prosperity.
I just want to share a quick thought about President Obama's rebalance towards Asia. An election occurs on a specific date, a peace agreement is signed, that is an event. What we've seen in Asia is a dramatic shift in the approach of peoples there. Last week we had a phenomenal visit to Washington by Prime Minister Modi. What he said in his joint session is the accumulative outcome of years of work. The transition in Sri Lanka is also part of a process that has been ongoing for many years. I visited Aung San Suu Kyi at the Rose Garden in her home. Now she's the counselor and acting as the president. So commendations are due the Obama administration for its slow and steady approach to peace building. It's not spectacular, but it's proven successful in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. I just want to say also a word of acknowledgement. Venu helped organize this event. Venu, stand up please so we can say thanks. In my office, Sumera organized the event. Sumera, many thanks to you. And some years ago, when I was a professor at NYU, I had a prize student named Ryan Miller, who's now the chief of staff to Nisha Desai Biswal. Ryan, it's great to see students surpass you. So thank you all for coming. As Visakha has said, this is part of an ongoing dialogue. International partnerships are going to be critical to helping Sri Lanka move forward. Those partnerships start at the table here with our discussion about ways that we can collaborate. So we're deeply grateful to you for coming, Nisha, and inspiring us with America's commitment, Visakha, with the work that you do every day on the ground, and the efforts that each and every one of you are making. So many thanks for coming. The work will continue.
There's a Sri Lankan caption behind, so please help yourself.
And there's a reception in the back, so if you want someone to eat or drink, please feel free.
Yes, that would be nice.
How are you? Recovered from all the work last week? Ready?